again, because the Duggar brand of conservatism has been framed as this, oh, you know, the girls don't even wear pants thing, they seem to think, and People magazine seems to help them get away with this belief that, oh, just because they're wearing pants now and they can show their shoulders, they're totally changed people. Welcome to Gossip in the Garden, where today we're going to be discussing the Duggar documentary, Shiny Happy People. So I've watched the full documentary at this point, and I actually have a lot of thoughts on it. I'm probably going to do multiple videos on it, but this is kind of just my first initial thoughts on it. If there's anything in particular that I discuss you'd like to hear more about, please let me know, and I'll make a more in-depth video on it. But basically, the general premise of Shiny Happy People was the fact that the Duggars were the public-facing, sanitized family, happy, well-adjusted people who were the propaganda wing for a church known as the iblp. Now, the iblp has gotten in a lot of trouble, both recently and in the past. The person who is behind it is Bill Gothard, and he has been accused of just horrendous things. I'm not going to go in depth in this video about that, just for the purpose of not wanting to trigger anybody, but all you need to know is that he abused his power. And I think that's one of the first things that I want to mention. I think a lot of times we make excuses for people, or we don't investigate people enough. Anytime you have a position or a scenario that puts people in power, you are going to have people who are drawn to that position because they want to use that power for bad reasons. A lot of times people don't want to believe people like pastors and other religious figures or political figures are bad because they just look at the, oh, well, they're supposedly holy or they have all of these beliefs. But people very seldom look critically at whether or not those people actually hold those beliefs, or if they just pretend to hold those beliefs because of the power and influence that they have in that position. And one of the things about the iblp is that it seemed to attract families where one or both parents, and they even said it outright, it was basically a breeding ground for cults and cult-like behavior, because you're teaching the women that if they get hurt, it's their fault. If they get harmed, it's because they're not in touch with Jesus enough, or it's because they were dressed improperly, or because they asked for it, or they acted improperly, or what have you. There is no scenario where the blame is ever pushed on the people that are actually committing harm. And beyond that, gossip and talking about others is looked very down upon in the iblp. And you're basically setting up a recipe for disaster, because you have these victims who believe that if they are victimized, that not only do they think that it is their fault, but if they announce the fact that they have been victimized, everyone around them, everyone that they know, is going to be raised in the same type of environment than they are. These groups are very insular. A lot of times all your friends, all of the people that you know are also part of this religious group. So in coming out and saying, oh, hey, I was harmed in this way, not only do you have that internal shame because you've been taught it was your fault, you know that everybody is going to look at you differently. And that's a recipe for disaster. It's a recipe for people getting hurt. And I mean, that's what we saw with Josh and his sisters. He harmed them. And like, you watch the Megyn Kelly interview and stuff like that, and you realize that these girls, they don't have the same philosophy about being harmed that people outside of their group have. And this is common not just in the iblp, but in a lot of other really strict religious groups that promote purity and that put this value on purity. Purity culture, in a lot of ways, you know, I wasn't raised in the iblp and my parents don't believe in purity culture, but because I went to Catholic school and I had that purity culture thrust upon me, there were scenarios where, like, I was staying with a boyfriend who harmed me because I didn't want my number to be any higher. Like, I had this belief that the number of people that I slept with was some indication of my value, and it encouraged me to stay in relationships that were harmful, because I was like, well, I've already slept with a lot of people, or, you know, comparatively what I'd been taught was a lot of people, because it was a few, and it really is not a good environment for women's rights and women's bodies being respected. Within the iblp, they took purity culture to such a point where the girls in the Duggar family would say Nike, they would say that to indicate to the boys that they needed to look away because there was a quote unquote immodest girl. And you basically make everything that is, you know, natural about sex and sexuality into a taboo and into something that is handled in a very unnatural way. And, you know, one of these women, not from the Duggar family, but somebody else from the iblp, was talking about how, like, she had been trained since birth to, like, preserve her virginity, and, you know, and that was her worth and her value. And then on her wedding night, her husband forced himself on her 3 times. And again, these women have been taught that if something bad happens to them, it is because they have stepped out of their protection. So they have this umbrella, and I think it initiated with the iblp, but I've now seen other religious groups use it, this like umbrella of protection, where you have the children and then the mother and then the father and then the church. And the basic belief is that if you obey the person above you in your quote unquote like umbrella of protection, that God will protect you. And that if God didn't protect you, it is because you have stepped out from underneath this umbrella. It is because you have done something that you shouldn't have done. It is profoundly victim blaming. Beyond just the fact that this group has this values, you then on top of it have TLC and other networks who have made television shows about families in this religious group. And in these television shows, they are really made out to be quote unquote good, shiny, happy people. And one of the things that they discuss is the meekness of the children. And that was heartbreaking for me because, like, children aren't naturally meek. And the way that they get the children meek in the iblp is by starting off with something called blanket training. So you have a child that is about 6 months of age and you lay them on a blanket and you put a toy that they want just out of reach off the blanket. And every single time they try to go to that toy, they are physically harmed. And they actually have like books that are promoted by the iblp that literally teach you how to get away with physically hurting your kid, but not leave marks that are going to get you in trouble if the police come. So, and like I was saying, you're teaching women that if they're hurt in these groups, that it's their fault. It's because they have stepped out from under God's protection. A lot of times these families are very large. These people are told that they should get married very young so that they can have as many children as possible. It's something called the quiverfull movement. Basically, they view each child as an arrow in God's army, and these children are supposed to go forth and spread the word of what they believe in. And the end goal is to try and raise a lot of conservative voters, conservative politicians. You had people like Duggar held office for a while. Josh Duggar worked with the Family Values Commission or whatever it's called. His brother tried to run for office. His brother and Jim Bob, I think, were both trying to run for office either right before or right during the trial where he was found guilty of having possession of heinous things. And during that trial, we got more information about how his family had systematically allowed Josh to continue without really punishing him or penalizing him or trying to get him the right amount of therapy. Like, they hypothetically sent him to this place where he was supposed to, you know, be better because they put him through hard labor. But when he was going through this punishment for having hurt his sisters, they started their show. And in order to be on like one of the documentaries that preceded their official TV show, they pulled Josh out of this program so that they could front as the normal happy family. So Josh's misdeeds against his sisters happened shortly before the show initially got public press. And early on in the show, or in the family trying to publicize their lifestyle, there was an appearance where they were supposed to be on Oprah, and someone reached out to Oprah and told her about what had happened, and Oprah was the force that eventually got an actual investigation started for it. You also had Jim Bob take Josh to see a friend of his who was also a cop, and this cop was supposed to quote unquote, you know, like put the fear of God into him or whatever, but this cop himself was convicted for similar crimes that Josh was convicted on. So you basically have this scenario where predators are protecting predators, and meanwhile, while all of this is happening, they are expecting their daughters who are victims to just act like everything is normal while their family starts a TV show show to promote their life. And like, it's kind of gross when you think of it, the amount of, I guess, just cockiness that their family had. Like, to know that Josh had done these things and that other people knew about it, but to be confident that they could have a television show around their family all the time and that they could hide it. Like, they had that level of confidence that their children were under that level of control, that the girls weren't going to say anything. It's unbelievable to me that TLC did not have any knowledge of the things that Josh did. And one of the things that we did find out about TLC is that in 2015, when we found out about the things that Josh had done and we found out about the Ashley Madison and stuff, it doesn't seem like there was ever a point where the Duggars could have lost the show. It seems like TLC was always working with Jim Bob to make there be some way for a show to continue. And that was when the show about the oldest daughters was spun off. So you have this weird scenario where the daughters were forced to relive some of the most awful things that had happened to them, something that they had been told was their fault. But then you also kind of had this presentation where, oh, the girls are victims. They shouldn't lose access to the show and the show's income just because of what Josh did. And it allowed the family to continue to air their harmful views. And it seems like Jill Duggar was in Shiny Happy People, and it seems like she really didn't want to be part of the show anymore. And she definitely didn't really want to be the focus of the show. But Jim Bob had her and Derek sign this contract the day before their wedding when they were rushing around, and neither of them really read what it was, and it was a 5-year obligation to the show that they couldn't get out of. And this is something that a lot of people in the Duggar snark communities have suspected for a while, that there was a contract that was keeping them on the show and that they were kind of trying to act out in order to get out of that contract and have TLC not want to work with them. But it's just like, at no point in this scenario were Josh's victims ever a consideration. It was just, how can we keep the propaganda wing of the iblp on TLC? And like, TLC is so complicit for the amount of families who saw this lifestyle that was being portrayed and thought it was something good and were drawn to it with their own families. And one of the things that they kept stressing with the iblp is that the people that tended to be drawn to the iblp were people who were desperate, people that were going through a loss or something of that nature, that were having financial problems, people who were unable to survive on their own, or at least felt that they were emotionally struggling to survive on their own, and who were looking for help. And what they got was this cult-like group. And it's not just me saying this. This is one of the allegations of the whole documentary, is that this is a cult or a cult-like group that attracts people in when they're at the worst, convinces them that they need to have a bunch of kids, and then also gives them beliefs that are so strict and stringent that it alienates them from the people around them that are already in their lives, that are not a part of this religion, who might have helped them out in ways that weren't going to cause harm to their family. It's like, you have all these people, and one of the things that they are told over and over and over again is that children are a gift from God, that you shouldn't try and prevent yourself from having children, that your children are a weapon in God's quiver against, you know, all of the anti-Christian forces in the world. And you have these people at this most desperate point of their lives who are struggling, who are told, oh, you know what you need? You need more kids. These families quickly ended up with more children than two parents can care for. And then the belief system is basically that pretty much as soon as your daughters are like 6 or 7 years old, that they can start taking care of other siblings. And on the Duggar show, this was the buddy system, and everybody thought it was so great that, you know, these kids took care of their siblings and stuff like that. But after these kids were weaned, it seems like Michelle didn't really take care of them at all. And like, these girls were like barely out of the single digits, if even that, and were now responsible for a child, a barely weaned toddler who is, you know, got a lot of needs of their own. And you cannot get an education when you are staying up all night to take care of this kid that you didn't ask for, that you didn't want, that is not your kid, so you're not getting an education. Because their culture can also be very fat shamey, a lot of times the kids aren't getting fed a lot because that's another way that keeps them docile and meek and prevents them from fighting back and prevents them from acting out. And then as soon as these girls hit adulthood, they're told you can't even kiss a guy, you can't really even hold hands with guys for the most part, and that you need to find a spouse and get married and start having kids as soon as possible. So you've got girls with barely any education that are being married off to guys who often do not respect women. There's a profound level of misogyny and just this belief that all women are good for is child rearing. So you're trying to marry these girls off as young as possible, starting them having babies as soon as possible. And in a lot of cases, these young women are realizing that the men that they have been married to have bad intentions for them. They're people who want to harm and control them, and then they don't have the skills to live on their own. A lot of times, everyone they know is involved with the church. And the women were saying that if they would go to like the church, like I don't know if they have like a chaplain or somebody like that, somebody who, a therapy type role, and these women were always told like, oh, you know, you just need to be a better wife and then your husband will behave better. Like, you can't better wife your way out of an abusive husband. That's just, there's no way out of that other than to leave in most cases. But when you have been having kid after kid after kid and you don't have any skills and you don't want to leave your kids with your spouse, you don't want to lose your kids to this spouse, like there's very few resources for them, or at least they perceive that there are very few resources for them to leave. A lot of times they've only had very limited access to the internet because they have this thing called Covenant Eyes or whatever that is supposed to monitor their access to the internet and things like that and report back what pages they're viewing to some other figure in their life, which is often their spouse. Like, a lot of resources are being taken away from these women. Now, one of my takeaways from the show is that we really need to be a lot more critical about fringe religious groups with strong control structures who utilize celebrities as their propaganda wing. And I think that we see that with people like Chris Pratt with Zoe Church. We see it with Justin Bieber and Hillsong and things like that. Like, these churches are using celebrities to make themselves, A, get more income, but also get themselves more vulnerable members. Because I'm sure, like, they talked to a number of people in this documentary about how, you know, their parents had been drawn to the iblp, you know, because they were desperate, because they were struggling as a family, and they saw the Duggars and saw what was presented as shiny, happy people.
In reality, we now know that the large majority of that is a lie. It's a deception, it's not true, and it behooves us to take a deeper look when we have celebrities that are promoting these organizations. And I absolutely believe, to a degree, that TLC should be held liable for the harm that came to people because of promoting iblp. Beyond that, we need more resources available to women who are leaving these groups, and realistically to anyone who has grown up in such a structure and who is trying to break free. It's become clear how controlling these structures are, and on the one hand, I am very proud of the Duggar girls who have managed to break free from the iblp, but I hope they aren't done analyzing their beliefs and where they fall on them, because it seems that the majority of the Duggar girls who have left their parents' faith are just thinking that they can simply wear pants and people will see them and think that they've freed themselves from this controlling faith structure. But the ones who have broken free still seem to be in faiths with extreme conservative structures that are anti-LGBTQ+, that are very promoting of purity culture, just not to the same degree. And as the large majority of people I know who grew up in purity culture can attest, a lot of those women suffered harm at the hands of other people, suffered mental health issues because their entire value is placed on their virginity and their purity, such that when they finally marry their spouse and lose their virginity, they feel as though they're dirty and worthless because they've been told their virginity is their worth. When you have a culture that makes normal sexual behavior taboo, you will always have people who come in and want to take advantage of the victims that you are cultivating. Because of what happened to me in the Catholic Church, I've done a lot of therapy groups and read a lot of victim stories, and I've seen person after person complain that being raised in purity culture caused them significant harm. And a lot of times, these are the groups projecting the hardest. These are the groups that are blaming the LGBTQ+ community for harming kids. They believe that we are going to use our power to harm kids because they want to use their power to harm kids. It frustrates me that the media always falls for that misdirection, and it really shows how uncritical the media is because they just regurgitate the claims made by these faith groups without investigating further or even thinking about them critically.
And I think one of the most frustrating things about this whole scenario is the fact that, I feel like a lot of people, especially in like the Duggar snark community and people who were raised in similar faiths but have gotten out of it, a lot of people have been saying for years that this is a hotbed for people, especially women and children, getting harmed, and that the network is just making it easier for these people to recruit victims and push mentalities that allow people to get more victimized. And there is very little questioning of it by the media because there are so few companies that own the media anymore, and one of them is the big TLC, WB, Discovery, or whatever. When you have only 4 or 5 companies that own most of the media, and a lot of those companies are in cahoots, are owned by people with similar mindsets, it's no wonder that there's nobody putting a critical lens to any of this and asking, okay, are people getting hurt in this? Is this something that we should be promoting? And TLC has suffered basically nothing from this. They may lose views on some of their shows from time to time, but they still have a ton of other shows, and like the large majority of their programming seems to be to make people think less of others. Like My 600-Pound Life is a really good example. My mom and I used to watch that, and the one thing that was consistent through that show is just the portrayal of a lot of these people is that they were lazy and that they didn't want to lose weight and that they weren't trying to lose weight, and that if Dr. Now yells at them enough that they'll suddenly be motivated to lose weight. But when you look at each episode, the large majority of these people are struggling until the point where they get therapy, and then it's revealed that the reason that they gained weight in the first place is because their dad hurt them, and they believed that the harm would stop if they were fat and thusly no longer attractive anymore. Like, so many of these people are CSA victims who gained the weight in order to make themselves less desirable to attackers. No amount of yelling at somebody is going to fix the psychological conditions that set them up to be in that position. And at least insofar as how the show portrays it, a lot of times it's like 6 months to a year in the process when they're finally getting therapy, or at least that we're finally being shown therapy. At minimum, the show is a very poor representation of how these patients should be handled. The first thing someone should do is look into their history and say, okay, are there reasons why this person psychologically is gaining weight, or physiologically? So many people have things like PCOS and other things that make it harder for them to lose weight, and it doesn't seem like they're ever tested for any of that stuff. They're just yelled at and told to do better, and most of these people are lower income. They don't have access to the kind of fresh fruits and vegetables and things like that at their grocery stores that a lot of people in higher income areas have, and just like the complete and utter lack of concern for their well-being. It's just shocking that there haven't been more people that ended up dead from that show. And that just seems to be TLC's modus operandi. It's just like, look at these people and how they're living their lives. And I think until or unless there are serious consequences to networks for causing psychological damage to people, causing people to want to join a religious group that is basically a cult because it's being portrayed with no one ever questioning, like, hey, is this actually safe and healthy? It's like, oh, no, these kids look okay. But like, based on what the Duggar daughters who have spoken out have said, it really seems like there is no way that TLC was completely blind to the fact that Josh had harmed his sisters, to the fact that physical harm was one of the ways that the very young children, like a 6-month-old child, should not be physically disciplined. They are too young to understand what they're even being disciplined for. And that's just another thing that leads those children to be vulnerable because they don't have a good trust structure with their parents, and they are liable to believe that the first person who comes along and treats them a little bit okay has their best interests in mind, and then you end up married to somebody who is hurting you, and you have a bunch of kids and you can't leave. So while overall I don't think we learned that much, because a lot of these things are things that have been at least suspected by the snarker communities for years now. Like, we have suspected pretty much since the very beginning that there were things going on in that family that were not good. And I mean, Michelle had even admitted to blanket training in at least one of the books that she had done. But you know, because Michelle talks with the baby boys, everybody is like, oh, she can't be that bad. And they really infantilize women. And let me tell you, when you promote like that virginity is the best thing ever, and traits that are associated with young women like high-pitched voices and giggling and not having an opinion of your own and things like that, when you promote those things as being the most desirable qualities in a woman, it's not surprising to me that you're both raising victims as well as predators. I think overall our culture in this country disproportionately values traits in women that are found in younger women, and we don't question it enough when you have people like Leonardo DiCaprio who can't date a woman over 25. We don't question enough what the long-term psychiatric impact of this is. You know, when you try to talk about stuff like that on social media, people have been so brainwashed to believe, oh, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can't ever hurt me. Yes, they can. Emotional and psychological damage, being gaslit, those things can and do cause PTSD. I know, because they've happened to me. And not only can they and do they cause PTSD, but that can lead to things like memory loss and brain damage and chronic pain and things of that nature. I really worry about the status of a lot of these women's bodies when they've been gaslit for half their lives and birthing children the other half. And the Michelle Duggars out there, sure, they have money to pursue actual medical treatment and things like that. But there are so many people that are a part of that faith that do not have a lot of money, that are dependent on the church and church friends for things like food and for babysitting and for their other needs, and who, if they speak out against it, will lose access to that. I'm glad that this documentary is making this information more available so people who might have been interested in joining that church or in living their lives more like the Duggars can maybe realize, oh crap, this is not the life for me. This is only going to lead to my ruination. And like, one of the things that they were going over is how bad the education was, especially for girls who, you know, like one girl said that her family had only taught her fractions because her father knew that she needed those to understand how to bake and didn't think that she needed any other math. They also have textbooks that are basically programming the children to slut shame. So they have all of these guidelines about what a modest outfit is, and they would show these children drawings of women in immodest outfits, and you would have to circle what is wrong. You are teaching your brain to be critical of people just because they don't cover their shoulders or their knees in the most godly of ways. Now, like I was saying earlier about how as a whole we need to be more critical and more investigatory of religious groups that are promoted by other celebrities, Jinger has made a book where she's all like, oh yeah, I'm so free now because I wear pants and I left my family's church, but her and her husband are still part of a church that has very restrictive conservative views. Like, very little in what their mindset actually is seems to have changed. They just wear pants now. And because the Duggar brand of conservatism has been framed as this, oh, you know, the girls don't even wear pants thing, they seem to think, and People magazine seems to help them get away with this belief that, oh, just because they're wearing pants now and they can show their shoulders, they're totally changed people. When you look into things that they have said about the queer community, and you can see that they're still very intolerant, you can see that a lot of the judgment aspect of their faith is still intact. And I am glad that the girls have made the improvement that they have, but I also don't think that organizations like People Magazine should be stupid enough to be fooled into thinking that the change has really been that significant. Just because Jana has been given a couple of businesses in her name, arguably to try and, hide family assets from some of the legal stuff that was going on, if she came home tomorrow and said she was a lesbian, she would still be kicked out of the family. Like that, there hasn't been significant change. Like the other thing is it blows my mind the degree to which family has supported Josh through all of his issues, including a very expensive legal defense that he arguably doesn't deserve. And whether the girls realize it or not, Jill was saying that she hadn't really received any payment from Jim Bob related to the show, and that TLC paid Jim Bob directly, which I don't think TLC should be doing. Especially if you're working with adults, those adults should be paid directly. And if you're working with children, those children should be paid into a fund that they have access to when they are adults. It should not be this scenario where these kids are working on this show, some of them literally since birth, and have signed contracts, extended contracts, or Michelle has signed contracts in their name to keep them involved, while Jim Bob gets all of the money and only gives some of it to the people that he sees fit, which is usually his sons, no matter what his sons do. No matter what Josh does, it doesn't seem like his family is ever going to cut off that financial lifeline, but yet they couldn't pay Jill and Derek for the work that they had been doing. And then when they did offer them a payout, it was like minimum wage from the age of 18 was all that the payout was. And on top of that, the payout was in a contract that would basically lifetime commitment to the show. Like all of the contracts that have been done have been in a way that honestly, I don't think should be considered legal. TLC should at minimum speak out on the fact that because of the way they were paying and because of the fact that they were trusting Jim Bob and not caring that he hadn't paid out any of the other family members, that is harm that they have caused these girls as well. And it is an additional barrier that keeps them tied to that church and that belief system. Because, like I said, a lot of times when you are part of a church, you are dependent in some ways on that church or the people, especially when you have that many kids, especially when you don't have a stable income coming in all the time. So I guess all things put together, I feel like there is a lot of room for improvement in how these reality TV shows are handled, the legalities behind them, especially things with like payment and an agreement on how especially children and young people are portrayed. I wish that there was something like like Europe has, where kids have a right to be forgotten. And I think that we're going to see this increasingly with family channels, where there is even less outside oversight. Like a lot of times, the only person who has all of the say is the parent. And we like to believe that these parents have their children's best interests at hand. But like, I look at families like the Ace family, who is making bank off of their children and then wasting that money and allegedly participating in scams. And these children are going to come of age and realize that they have worked their whole life performing for the camera and have nothing to show for it except for a reputation that was set by somebody else. And like one of the things that I mentioned in my Harry video, my Prince Harry Spirit video, is that a lot of times these parents or these shows or the media creates a narrative for a child or a family, and then kid doesn't get any say in how they're portrayed, and portraying a child constantly as like the naughty child or the misbehaving child or something like that. It gives them no reason to fight against that, you know? And I think it gives a lot of kids identity issues. And I refuse to believe in these massive families that are part of the iblp that they are not raising a single gay kid. And I don't know from personal experience, because my family has always been pretty accepting, but I've known a lot of friends who grew up in, like, you know, Mormon or Amish or other really strict religious groups, and who really struggled with their identity and their mental health. It was very harmful to them in a lot of ways. I feel like at minimum, we need to be holding the networks and the parents and things like that more accountable for not protecting their kids and for prioritizing money over the child's long-term well-being. All right, that is all I have for today. I mostly just wanted to vent a lot. If there was anything in particular that you would like me to say more on this topic, please let me know down in the comments below. I have considered doing a more sit-down formal type video on this topic, but just kind of wanted to get my immediate thoughts vomited out first. So let me know what you would like to hear more about, and I will try to deliver it. And thank you so very much for watching. I'm sorry if the sound cut out for a while, because I think it did. And have a lovely day.